She died an horrific death. This was no lover's tiff.
I know that she was frightened of his violence.
One can only imagine the pain of being hit by an ice axe.
He actually packaged the body up and put it in a place where it was probably never going to be found.
This is the story of an almost perfect murder. Of a killer whose crime would go undetected for 21 years. And of a woman whose body was cleverly concealed in the murky depths of Coniston Water in the Lake District. Her murderer believed she'd never be found. The story would begin in 1997 with the chance discovery of the body. It would spark a police investigation spanning 7 years. And see a respected schoolteacher arrested twice before justice would finally be served.
Well, the day for me had started really early. We'd been diving very early in the morning. It was a beautiful day like today. We decided that we would go a bit farther than we would normally go because this is quite a popular site, so it's a bit boring at times.
We set the dive depth at about 25 metres. After about 12 metres, the cliff it isn't a cliff as such, it's a steep banking, runs out and you go onto just a silty banking.
And all of a sudden, we came across this package. We say all of a sudden because the visibility down there is probably less than about 2 metres. And it's also very, very dark, but it was still a very, very eerie thing to see. Quite frightening at the time. Well, I felt very apprehensive about it. We actually thought it was something that had fallen off a boat. As it turned out, it did.
The package was resting on a ledge, only meters short of the deepest part of the lake.
And I thought when I went over to it I'd be able to lift it, but it had some weights of some sort holding it down. Quite heavy, I couldn't lift it by hand anyway.
The divers brought the mystery package to the surface.
And we noticed that it was pretty well bound up. And Dave took his diver's knife and started to cut the binding. We were just quite keen to see what was in it, because it felt very hard.
When I cut the first cord, a bit of lead pipe dropped off.
That sort of increased the apprehension somewhat, because then you realise that it wasn't a lucky find after all, it was going to be something else. It was very white, sort of very similar to a chicken, I suppose, that kind of texture to it. So at that point we decided that it was, we'd better send for the police.
I went out there not really knowing what to expect. It is pitch black around Coniston at night as well, and I remember driving around not totally sure where I was going at the time.
The divers had discovered a 21-year mystery. The package was human.
It became obvious from the outset that a body found in that condition that we were dealing with a murder case, due to the fact that the body was weighted down, the body had been tied up.
The post-mortem would reveal the savagery of the crime and begin to hint at the inventiveness of the killer.
The body was contained essentially within 2 bin bags, but when they'd been removed, there was material which turned out to be, in fact, a pinafore dress, which had been drawn up at one end and covered the top part of the body. And then when that was removed, of course, we came down to the nightdress, that was quite clearly, easily recognisable as a baby doll type nightdress.
It was a woman's body, tightly bound in a fetal position.
It is unusual. I've never seen one that was dropped so elaborately with such a series of ropes and knots and string to attach to the various parts of the body.
Her death had been quick and brutal.
The cause of death was almost certainly related to the injuries to the face. All the bones of the face had been smashed and the teeth had been damaged. There had been a cutting action as well. One possibility would be an ice axe. There were injuries to the hand, to the left hand, which in fact were of the kind we see when someone has raised their hand to the face or head to try to protect themselves.
The police now knew she'd suffered a violent death, but there was so little left of the body, they were still no closer to identifying her.
From what we were told this morning and from the post-mortem, it would appear that this lady is aged between 20 and 30, 5'1" to 5'4", with short, dark hair. Anyone who can give us some information as to anyone or a lady of that description who is missing anything up to 20 years ago, please let us know.
When the newsflash came on the television, we'd just come back from holiday in Austria.
And he said, "That's our Carol." And I said, "Don't be daft." And he said, "It is."
I thought, this is it, this is Carol. And so I immediately rang the police and said, has anybody suggested the name of Carol Park?
There was a flood of calls to police that night, all suggesting the same name.
Well, we worked over the initial few days of the investigation on the list of missing people that we had, and Carol Park began to feature heavily in that inquiry, and it became obvious that she could be the person who we were looking for.
Dental records finally confirmed her identity as 30-year-old Carol Ann Park, a teacher and mother of 3 who'd gone missing from home in 1976.
We are on the trail of whoever did this. 21 years on, I'm quite sure he or she thought they were safe and it was all over with. It isn't. We are on the trail.
Carol was married to fellow schoolteacher Gordon Park when she disappeared. For 21 years, he'd maintained that she'd abandoned her family for another man.
I believed that Gordon Park had put her in that lake. He knew Coniston like the back of his hand.
Well, we'd always suspected that it had been a nasty end for Carol. Pretty certain who was responsible.
But it's someone who was devious. And I remember Gordon could be devious.
The police shared their certainty and arrested Park. After 2 days of questioning, he was charged with murder. It seemed they had their man, but Park had time on his side. He'd had 21 years to cover his tracks. An 8-year police battle to bring Carol Park's killer to justice was just beginning. The body of Carol Park had lain undiscovered on the bottom of Coniston Water for 21 years, before amateur divers found her one Sunday morning. She'd been brutally murdered, her face obliterated with an axe. Police believed her husband, Gordon Park, was the killer. But they needed to understand their prime suspect and discover what had driven him to such extreme violence after just 9 years of marriage. The couple were both war babies, brought up in the town of Barrow in the shadow of the Lake District. Carol was adopted and raised by the Price family.
It was the end of wartime, and the next thing I knew was my father telling me one evening that when I got home he'd come to collect me at my grandparents'. There was a surprise for me, and when I got home there was this young baby girl. She was lying in a wicker basket, and that was the first recollections I have of Carol.
She grew into an intelligent girl with a firm ambition to escape the back streets of Barrow. Her first step was to put herself through college and become a teacher. Then she met and fell in love with Gordon Park, the son of a successful local businessman.
He was the boy about town. This is the way I saw it. He was possibly the lad that a few girls really wanted to go out with. He'd got an eye for Carol, and Carol went for it.
They were very different. Police discovered Carol had been the social butterfly, while Park was quieter, aloof and controlling. His passion was the great outdoors, where he liked to pit himself against nature through climbing and sailing. He was strong and resourceful, and Carol fell in love. When he proposed, she believed it to be a fairy tale union.
She was very much looking forward to getting married. I think she was besotted with Gordon. She would walk over coals for Gordon. You could see that.
When she'd married Gordon, she thought she'd married quite well.
The newlyweds moved to a smart village outside Barrow. where the practical Park had built a bungalow for his new bride.
It must have impressed her somewhat, I'm sure it did. It wasn't just an ordinary bungalow, I mean, it was a beautiful bungalow built high above the town and the village of Lees. And I'm sure the envy of many, many people at that time. And it was beautifully laid out inside, it was very impressive.
I don't think it was for Carol, really. It was for his own pride and self-aggrandisement, I would say.
The house, named Bluestones, was Park's pride and joy, and the couple's early years there were happy. But by 1972 they had 3 children under 5, and Carol was juggling motherhood with teaching. Her friends and family were now concerned that the man she'd admired for his mastery of all things had now mastered her.
I think that Gordon was a bit of a control freak. Carol could do nothing socially on her own, although she was a professional person, and she didn't have access to her salary, which is amazing. He put it in a bank and she couldn't touch it.
And I realised that things were very bad out there, at least. I felt that she was being, looking at the situation, she was somewhat being dominated, controlled, if you will. And Carol could have a quiet nature at times and wouldn't quite express herself as to what the problem was. But I gathered as I went out there that things were far from right. You could feel the atmosphere.
In 1974, Carol took a lover, left home and moved into a guest house in the Lakes. There she made plans for a new life for herself and the children in Middlesbrough, with her lover.
She turned up with her suitcase and carrying a hairdryer in her hand. Gordon brought her, and the 3 children were in the back of the car. I would have expected family goodbyes and a hug to the children if Mum wasn't going to see them for a little while. And I thought he was rather harsh the way he insisted that they stayed in the car.
Over the next 4 months, Carol would begin to hint at the nightmare at home.
And I said, "Do you mean he hit you, that he was violent towards you?" And Carol said, "There's more than one ways of being cruel. I've had to do things I didn't want to do, and I've always had to obey him because he thought he was in charge." So she didn't actually say he'd hit her, but I know that she was frightened of his violence.
Carol was too frightened to meet Park in private to discuss custody of the children, preferring the sanctuary of the local pub instead. And she made sure Anne's husband was standing by to collect her in case things turned sour.
And she said, "I'll judge his mood. I might let him bring me back if I think everything's all right, but I'll know whether I dare get in the car with him." I think out of 3 visits to the pub, Gordon brought her back up to our house once, and she rang for my husband twice.
At Christmas 1974, Carol left for the northeast alone, the custody battle still unresolved. Over the next few months, Park controlled what little access she had to the children.
She had these, to visits to my mother's to see the children, and they were always supervised, and that she wasn't allowed to see the children on their own. Apparently my mother says they go in the front room and Gordon's there and all this business, and it was very inhuman.
There was nothing in life for her if she couldn't get those children back. She had plans for all 3 of them. Then she had plans for perhaps her and Gordon sharing them, and nothing would satisfy him but that he kept them away from her.
Carol pinned her hopes on the custody hearing of March 1975. But Park was equally determined. He too had had an affair, but unlike Carol, he denied it under oath and was awarded custody of the children. It was the turning point in Carol's life. Now the only way she could be with her children was to return home to a loveless marriage.
She made the ultimate sacrifice in '75, leaving the chap she was living with, a decent guy, a nice home, a good future. She couldn't. She had to leave that to come back because she loved these kiddies, these 3 children that were more important than anything else in the world, and she proved that.
After 4 months,